Look at the number all the way to the right. The average tourist mile, which is how far did each guy who went or girl who went to the Bahamas travel to get there. Those average 1,400 people traveled an average of 1,100 miles. All right? What I do is I take Cuba's equivalent. I take it for every country. It's in the paper. And I just multiply. If you came from France, this is how far you traveled. How many people came from France? If you came from China, this is how far you traveled. How many people came from China? The average for Cuba is 3,250. It's 3 times. So what do you think happens when you let the United States enter that market? That number drops, and distance is far and away in every study, in every industry that uses the trade model. And by the way, this model explains 85% of the variation in the data. So this is very effective, astronomically high R squared. The distance measure, which is a hugely successful measure of cost of trade, of what determines whether people trade with each other, it goes to 1/3. What you're doing is you're lowering the cost. It's like giving Americans a tax break. It's raising their real income, and you're opening to them the largest supplier at a much lower cost. That's the short answer. Now, you know, I did a lot of work, so I'll go through the long answer as well. But that's basically it, you know. So look, the red dotted line is where we think countries should be. This is a cut for the United States, so I'm saying, where should the U.S. be relative to other countries? And you shouldn't focus too much on the differences of individual countries because we have 22 OECD nations, right? So this is just one of them, although this is a very important one. And what you see, the red circle is demonstrating, is that, you know, Cuba, I mean, it's just flat, and it should be moving up. That gap will be filled. Our prediction is that that will be closed. So how big is that gap? What does it mean in real terms? What can you take home from this? It's like putting Cuba near New Zealand. All right? The distance for a US traveler is the equivalent of 7,000 nautical miles. It's the inverse of Puerto Rico. So all of the advantage that Puerto Rico has from being a hub and from being, you know, from having, I think, are there more Puerto Ricans in New York than in Puerto Rico?
Not yet.
But we're getting there.
Yeah, we're getting there.
And that, you know, these guys come home and all this sort of data, these are huge data problems because they just get a huge number of people coming in, especially, you know, Christmas time, things like that. Cuba has the opposite. So that same number appears with a negative sign when you try to predict Cuba's arrivals. This is just, it's a very large sort of change that could happen with a stroke of a pen. And what that does is, and we should realize, what the data is pointing out is that the rest of the Caribbean is enjoying substantial trade protection, especially countries that are heavily U.S. dependent, especially countries that, you know, why does Aruba receive 500,000 U.S. visitors? It's off the coast of Venezuela. Is that viable? You know, according to my numbers, it's receiving about half of what Bahamas does. We don't know, you know, when you reprice these vacations and you no longer have this, you know, oh, go to Mexico and then go back and then hopefully they don't stamp your passport, you come back home, Treasury Department's coming after you. When none of that happens anymore, when all of that is gone, when people have the lure of Havana, when people have the lure of Varadero, you're going to have to start pricing vacations on the basis of your economic fundamentals. You won't have that anymore. And so, you know, this is a change that one should take into account. Once removed, we see net regional arrivals increase between 2 and 11%. And an easy explanation as to why that happens is, once again, what you're doing is you're lifting the yoke off the American consumer and the Cuban producer. This is affecting both sides of the Florida Straits. It's, in some sense, governments are imposing this policy, and, you know, John Doe can't go on vacation, and Juan Perez can't sell him mojito. So they're both, you know, absorbing this. What happens in terms of the neighboring region, other destinations? Well, you win or you lose depending on certain things. This is a graph that's very big, and I will make it easier in a minute. Basically, we see new visitors, we see 3 to 3.5 million visitors going into Cuba. That's what we estimate, and that's a very robust result. And the question is, do they come from the Caribbean, or are they people that, for example, no longer vacation in Panama City, Florida, and Fort Lauderdale, and so they're new, sort of new to the region. If they're new to the region, then we all win, right? Jamaica, there's no skin off your back, because whoever was coming here will continue to come here. And what you'll have is new people coming to the region. And in fact, this is core to my paper. What you have is people who are vacationing in Cuba now will most likely leave Cuba because they will be outbid, because the Americans who are going to show up will have higher real incomes. You've given them a tax break, and that tax is enormous. It's the opposite of, Puerto Rico, which has a huge subsidy, which has, virtually free trade with the U.S., or completely free. It's an integrated territory. So when these Americans show up to Cuba, they will have very high real incomes relative to what they had a day ago, right? You just give them a huge raise. So they show up and they outbid the other ones, and we know, the demand is there. Recall the maps I showed. So if they're all new Americans, if none of them divert from Jamaica to go to Cuba, then the whole region does better. That's a very benign forecast. So we don't, being who we are, we don't project the most benign forecast. The other extreme is assume that nobody new comes from the U.S. So that everybody, those 3 to 3.5 million people that show up to Cuba, have to come from within the region. Well, then the region takes a very big hit. And that would be the most pessimistic forecast, because you have to basically go from destination to destination and just remove enough Americans so as to come up with that 3.5 million figure and dump it onto Cuba. That's, I would say, unlikely. We know that there's substantial pent-up demand to visit Cuba in the United States. So what some analysts have suggested is sort of a compromise, which is the last column, and it's about 2/3 from the region and 1/3 from the United States. Okay, so 2 million come from the region, about 1 million or 1.5 million from the U.S. And what happens is, how do we predict the winners and the losers? Well, what you do is you look at the dependents, right? We have a lot of, and I'm not going to go into all the detail now, but we have a lot of results in the paper that show that there's substitutability, there's limited substitutability in the region, so that maybe I don't go to Cancun, maybe I go to Cuba. Well, if all that Cancun receives is Americans, then they will be impacted by the substitutability because they have to come from somewhere. And so places like the Dominican Republic stand to actually gain from lifting the embargo, because while they do lose Americans, Americans are a small share of their total base. They're very diversified, and the current Italians and French, and there's a bunch of them, and Canadians who are in Cuba now will redeploy to the region, okay? And so if you're successful at picking up these these Canadians, the British, the French, the Italians, the Spanish, if you can get these populations in an environment where Americans are going to Cuba, you win. If you don't, and we know, for example, that Cancun has not succeeded or it's successful, but not according to the data. I think there's other areas in Cancun that do depend heavily on Italians, for example, in the Riviera Maya. But in these data, what we show is that the Cancun center depends heavily on Americans. So when you need to come up with Americans, you need to take them from Cancun, you need to take them from Jamaica, you need to take them from Bahamas, U.S. Virgin Islands, Aruba. These are the major donors, because these are the countries that seem to have way too many relative to what fundamentally